We are looking into the future, and we are covering a theme now which I've given the words global catastrophe, because we're talking of a day of evil that's global in its context. And we've reached part 4 of that mini-series, if you like. And this, I want to start thinking about the person that we come to know as the Antichrist. And I just feel in my heart of hearts that this is not to be undertaken lightly. As you look at this screen in front of you, you might sort of gulp, because particularly when I came to look at the material that I prepared some time ago, when we get to this point in the series, the Antichrist, I realise I've got too much material to give in one talk. And so I've wanted to break up that material, I thought, into 2. As I've been pondering it this morning, I might even think that we need a 3rd talk on this subject alone. I want to reflect on some of the things that we dealt with in the last talk. Because when I was preparing this series in the summer, I saw something which I think is really important, more clearly, I think, than I have thought before, and I'm calling it the divine principle. We've dealt with it, but I want to think about it again. Yeah, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. We know that's in the book of Romans chapter 1, but I'm more particularly interested in this talk in thinking what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 9 in this particular instance. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. I think this is a divine principle. And I think past history and future history will bear this out. And in particular, I want to think of a vision that was given to the prophet Jeremiah, which we read about in chapter 30. Because it's controversial, inevitably. It is controversial because of how this verse is interpreted. Says this: how awful, in fact it's not easy even to read the words, how awful that day will be. None will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob, but he will be saved out of it. And I use this terrifying photograph as the backdrop. Now this is where you get a difference of opinion between believers. Because the fact of the matter is that many, I might even say most, Christian Zionists, evangelical Christians in a general sense, and even Messianic believers, many, perhaps most, suggest that this time of Jacob's trouble is still future. And if you look at the screen now, you see after the word future, I've got 3 dots, dot. This is really to say, Jeff, don't say too much at this point, because you could get carried away with things that are perhaps too harsh. For me, without any question, I see the Holocaust as the culmination, the climactic event that completes the time of Jacob's trouble. Full stop. That's what I believe. So why is the suggestion made? I think it's pretty straightforward. There are 2 reasons I'm going to give you now. The time of Jacob's trouble, generally speaking, is often equated to the Great Tribulation, which will be the period of time before Jesus returns. Specifically equated. So the Great Tribulation, in other words, also can be understood as the time of Jacob's trouble. Therefore, the focus of that Great Tribulation is the Jewish people. And one of the side issues, it means that the Holocaust itself is relegated to a footnote in history. And as we're coming up to the memorial service in 2 weeks' time, the Holocaust Memorial Day service, to think that the Holocaust should be relegated as a footnote and what is coming is so much worse for the Jewish people is a denial, in my opinion, and you can understand that I'm getting a bit heated. It's a denial of the divine principle. Because at the end of the day, it depends how you define the word save. Because going back to this verse in Jeremiah chapter 30, how awful that day will be. None will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob, but he will be saved out of it. The question is, how do you interpret the word save? Well, we've talked about the Hebraic mind that sees the physical and the spiritual as a whole. In Christian terms, we understand the word save somewhat differently. And Israel is not saved in that spiritual sense today. So the reasoning is this: something has to happen in order to drive Israel to its knees and therefore be saved. However, Jeremiah chapter 30, in the chapter, Jeremiah 30, of which this is verse 7, the Lord explains what he means by save. Because in verse 10, for example, it says this: I will save you out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob again will have peace and security. We're talking Israel here, folks. And no one will make him afraid. What God says is this. This is the Lord's declaration. I am with you and will save you. And if you read the subsequent verses in Jeremiah chapter 30, you're talking about the restoration of the nation. The Holocaust precedes that. The re-establishment of the nation of Israel is out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Consequently, I believe the time of Jacob's trouble is now past. There are differences of opinion. So it does depend on how you define the word save. Yeah, Paul says it in Romans 11. One day it will be true. All Israel will be saved. And I look forward to that day. There's a lot to happen. We've spoken about many of these things over the months. However, having said that, and what I want to do in this talk and in future talks more particularly, when I'm dealing with the same issue of the Antichrist, the time of Jacob's trouble, which I believe to be the Holocaust, and that period of time in particular, sets a pattern for the Great Tribulation in days to come. We can learn an awful lot about what it's going to be like in the days to come as we understand that the Holocaust, the time of Jacob's trouble in particular, sets a pattern for the Great Tribulation. This is what the Lord says. These are not straightforward words. Jeremiah chapter 30 verse 11. Though, this is the Lord speaking, this isn't Jeff, this is the word of God. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. So here, in Jeremiah chapter 30, you see the outworking of the divine principle. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, and only the Lord can determine what's what here. First for the Jew, and then for the Gentile. But it goes on. But glory, honour and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. For God does not show favouritism. Glory, honour and peace are highlighted. So how does that work out? Well, we could go to Isaiah's vision to see that. One day this will be true. We read about it in Isaiah chapter 60. Arise, shine, the Lord speaking to the nation of Israel. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. So, okay, Paul has just told us that glory, honour and blessing and peace in particular will come first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. This is what it says in Isaiah chapter 60. It goes on to say, see, at this time, darkness covers the earth and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you and his glory appears over you. So thick darkness is over the peoples, the Gentiles, at the time that the light has come and the glory of the Lord rises upon the nation of Israel. So what happens then? Nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn. So it's this second part of the verse, glory, honour and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile, for God does not show favouritism. How do you read that part of the verse, I wonder? If the Lord has done what he has done in terms of judgment, as far as the Jewish people are concerned, it must also be true that that judgment will come to the Gentiles, or else God would show favouritism. But God does not show favouritism. So the divine principle holds, I believe. The second important point that I want to refer to is what I'm now calling the deception problem, because Jesus spoke about it particularly in Matthew chapter 24, which is part of the Olivet Discourse as described in the book of Matthew. This is verse 23, at that time. What time? At that time. But what time is it? When this deception problem becomes such a difficulty for believers. Well, if we look at the previous verse, we've dwelt on it quite a lot, this particular verse. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. This is what Jesus says. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. This is verse 22 of Matthew 24. And then Jesus says, at that time. So these are in the days that we spoke about in the last talk. It's at that time we need to be aware that false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect. What does it tell you? The elect are here on planet Earth. It's the only way you can read Scripture. To deceive even the elect, if that were possible. No wonder the days have to be cut short. See, I have told you ahead of time. And then, as we went to in our last talk to the Apostle Paul. This is a very important 2 verses. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until. It can't come until what? The rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. The day's not going to come. So we need to think about this. What do we need to think about? Well, what is the rebellion that the Apostle Paul is speaking about? Who is the man of lawlessness who is going to be revealed? And then where is God's temple? Those 3 things. Let's begin with the rebellion. What is it? I need a Greek scholar at this point, so I'm looking to Jeremy. Yeah. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs. Well, Jeremy must correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the word that is translated as rebellion, which I think is pronounced apostasia. Am I right, correct. Jeremy? Oh, good.
Yes, correct.
And of course,
standing away from.
We can understand that in English. Apostasy. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the apostasy occurs, you could say. Would be an appropriate translation, I think. And what is apostasy? Well, this is what the Encyclopedia Britannica says on the subject. Apostasy, the total rejection of Christianity by a baptized person having at one time professed the Christian faith, publicly rejects it. This is the Encyclopedia definition of apostasy. It is distinguished from heresy, that's interesting, which is limited to the rejection of one or more Christian doctrines by one who maintains an overall adherence to Jesus Christ. So apostasy is much more than that. It's the total rejection of Christianity by a baptized person. This is how the Encyclopedia Britannica defines it. Well, what does Jesus say? Again, of course, in the Olivet Discourse, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. This is the 5th seal, or at least an outworking of the 5th seal. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, Jesus says, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. So I can highlight the word many and many here. But Jesus goes on. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Now we're talking of more than many. We're talking of most. But the interesting thing here is that the word for love is the word agape, which is the love of God. It's his love. It's selfless love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And what is hot is growing cold. And hot growing cold is lukewarm. Now, believe me, folks, I'm talking to Jeff Barnard here. Lukewarm. Is he lukewarm? Now, this is an interesting slide, because this is the work of my friend across the street. We talked about Rick already, Rick Winnicky. And this was a piece of work that he did before the Fountain of Tears, which he calls the lukewarm church. Interesting sculpture. And of course Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. It's Revelation chapter 3 verse 16. Actually, I came to faith through a verse in Revelation chapter 3. Of course, perhaps many of us have also done that. Revelation 3 verse 20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. I'd learnt it off by heart as an 18-year-old. And that was the verse that was shared with me when I went forward at Billy Graham Crusade in 1966. I knew that the Lord had met me. But actually, the Lord is not using that verse 20, as an evangelistic tool. It can be used as such, of course. He was talking to the lukewarm church of Laodicea. The fact is, I think this is true. If you start cold, you don't get to lukewarm very easily. But if you start hot, you can come down to lukewarm. And that's insipid, and the Lord would spit that out of his mouth. It's a fact. I'm not talking to anybody else here, folks. I'm talking to me and my house. So in summary, what is the rebellion that occurs, that has to occur before the day of the Lord comes, when the Lord returns? It is apostasy. It is turning away from true faith. But the question that we could ask is, why is the love of most growing cold? These are the words of Jesus. And of course the straightforward answer is what Jesus said, because of the increase in wickedness. But I also think that this is true. Many will say, we were not meant to be here now. Isn't that true? Isn't that what they said? That we would get a rapture that would take us out of this time where there is an increase in wickedness. But we, the elect, will still be here. And I think that the disappointment will lead to many losing their love and growing cold. So the second point that we move on to is, who is the man of lawlessness? What does it say? Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs. We've talked about apostasy, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. Has he been revealed? I don't think so. The man doomed to destruction. I've highlighted 3 words. The man of lawlessness, who ultimately is the Antichrist, he must be revealed. We must know who it's going to be when the time comes. We will know who it's going to be when the time comes. I think that this takes place after the rebellion, after the apostasy, or perhaps by the rebellion, by the apostasy. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs. So apostasy has happened. I think apostasy must come first. That has to set the scene in order for the man of lawlessness to be revealed. And it's because of the increase in wickedness or lawlessness, in another version, the love of most will grow cold. I think apostasy must come first. And I think that he must appeal to believers, particularly the lukewarm. The cold might not be interested, but the lukewarm might be interested. You see, false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles. It's going to be easy to be deceived at this time. Even the elect, if it were possible. Jesus is preparing us ahead of time. We need to be prepared for this, I believe. However, he must be revealed, but he is also doomed This is what Paul says a little bit later in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendour of his coming. This is the time when the Antichrist will be doomed, according to the book of Revelation 2 as well. At the splendour of his coming. And then in Daniel, which is, I think, a passage, particularly in the later part of Daniel chapter 11, which can refer to this future person who is coming, he, it's a man, will pitch his royal tents between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. So we know the end from the beginning. We got the text. But he will exalt himself. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped. These are signs of the Antichrist that we can focus on. And again, in Daniel chapter 11, it speaks of the fact that there is to be a king who will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. The two passages, I think, are somewhat parallel. So, if we're looking particularly at the book of Daniel for examples, I think it's clear that we have a pattern and a precedent when it comes to the man of lawlessness, who we've come to know as the Antichrist. And that person, I believe, is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's part of a dynasty. I think this is significant. Others might not think it so, but I think it is. I think we find biblical prophetic motifs that will be repeated at the last, particularly in the 2nd century BC. And if we consider particularly Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he's part of a dynasty. It's the Seleucid dynasty. And here's a list of kings, beginning with Alexander. We need to know something of the history, 2nd century BC in particular. There's a list of kings here. And this is what it says earlier in Daniel. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, I'm going to show it. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. Now, when we see the context, the 2nd century context of some of the prophetic that is within Daniel, we see how historically accurate it is. So much so that liberal scholars cannot believe that the book of Daniel was actually written in the 6th century. It had to be written in the 2nd century because it's so historically accurate. Antiochus Epiphanes appears after that other list of kings, and 3 of them are subdued in the process. This is Seleucus IV and his sons, who were heirs to the throne. One was called Demetrius, the other one was called young Antiochus. Both of them, those three were subdued in order for Antiochus Epiphanes to usurp the throne. It's historically accurate, this prophecy. Now, I believe this. I think it's helping us understand what might be ahead. Others may disagree, but this is what I believe. Here's another list of 10 kings. Of course, we're talking 1st century of the Christian era, the common era, sometimes it's called. Now, in the book of Revelation, if you look at chapter 17. Now think, folks, this is chapter 17. This is well on in the book of Revelation. It says this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. Now this is really interesting because I think that we have to see that initial fulfillments of prophecy, even within the book of Revelation, were fulfilled in the 1st century. And this one in particular, which is so accurate. The one who was to come would only remain for a little while. Actually, it was 3, Galba, Otto and Vitellius, Caesars who came after Nero. Now that I find really interesting, because I think that in a strange way this series of 10 kings repeats what took place in the 2nd century BC. And we read this one already. I wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn which came up before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now, the very interesting thing, it says, before which 3 of them fell. And that was true, Seleucid dynasty, but it's also true for the Roman dynasty as well. So I think that this parallel fulfillment, in fact, is very significant, and it helps us what may happen in the future. This is borne out by the fact that in 669 AD, there were 4 emperors. It's called the year of the 4 emperors, and of course we get to Vespasian. Now Vespasian established a new dynasty. It was known as the Flavian dynasty, and here you see the 3 Caesars who were part of that dynasty. This is quite interesting because we understand these things because of the writings of Josephus, whose born name was Joseph ben Mattatyahu. But he went over to the Romans and changed his name, and he became Titus Flavius Josephus. You can see how he is linked to the Flavian dynasty. So we have an awful lot of information, historical information about this time. And here we see the Colosseum. Now some have suggested that actually it was built by Nero, but it wasn't built by Nero. It was initiated by Vespasian. And it was completed during the Flavian dynasty. And here, within the Colosseum, many Christian martyrs gave their lives. And I believe, therefore, it is true that we can apply this verse in Revelation chapter 14 to the situation that pertained in the days of Vespasian and the Flavian dynasty. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. See, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is an archetype of the Antichrist. He did, and so will the Antichrist, oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped. Obviously, therefore, Antiochus Epiphanes is in the mind of Paul when he writes about the man of lawlessness who will be revealed, as it says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But I think Antiochus is also in the mind of Jesus. Because Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now I believe with all my heart that this was fulfilled in the first, but most particularly in the 2nd century AD. And the question is why? Why would the Lord prepare his disciples to flee Jerusalem when they saw the abomination of desolation, which was a repeat of the prophetic motif that was established in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes? Why would he want them to leave Judea and flee to the mountains? It's because of the gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And this message has to get to the ends of the earth before the end will come. And therefore it was necessary at that time for those in Judea, when they saw the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, that they would get out, and they had the opportunity to do so. I believe in particular it was fulfilled in the 2nd century in the days of Hadrian, and we have dealt with the Emperor Hadrian on many occasions. So what can we say? We've got a number of people, historical characters that we could look to, who are in fact archetypes of the Antichrist in antiquity. So what can we say about this person who will be revealed at the right time? What can we say about him? What are his characteristics? I think, this is my understanding, on the basis of the fact that there is such parallelism between what took place in the 2nd century BC and in the Roman dynasty, I believe that the future Antichrist will be part of a dynasty. Can I tell you what dynasty? No, I cannot tell you what dynasty. But I believe that he will be part of the dynasty. Like Antiochus Epiphanes and Vespasian to a certain extent, he is going to be a usurper to the throne. In other words, he will be royal. How do I know that? Well, for a start, he's the usurper to the throne. That's the first thing to say. And secondly, it says this in Daniel. These are words that can be applied, obviously, both to Antiochus Epiphanes, but also to the future Antichrist. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined must take place. This was true in the 2nd century BC. It will be true at the last, obviously, because the time of wrath will be completed. And here's another verse that seems to indicate that he's royal. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. This is talking of the final battle, of course. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. And he will exalt himself. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So the question for us now is, where is God's temple? And we'll do that next time.